The laws of nature do not generate life. The laws of nature present many hard problems.
If you believe you've been misled by the incessant appeals to the authority of science, then we think maybe it's time you should listen to your body.
It's great to be here to talk to you about your design body, but I'd like to start by telling you why Steve and I wrote this book, what was on our heart. We wanted to try to help people answer the most important question. Are you a cosmic accident? Did the human body result from billions or maybe trillions or quadrillions of happy accidents? Or were you intended? Does purpose underlie your existence? Both cannot be true. No question has greater impact on how you live your life. And each person must answer for himself or herself. But what about your children and grandchildren? Why are so many young people losing faith? Discovery Institute did a study in 2016 and found out it was all due to mainly Darwinism. But what if we're all being misled by the science? So how are you going to answer this question? Well, you can't do it in a vacuum. You have to sort of have information. You have to know how life actually works, not just how it looks, because Darwinism is totally about how life just looks, very superficial. You also have to know what it takes to stay alive and how to build life from the ground up. What's the reality of the thing? You need to learn to ask better questions. Expect good answers. Don't be easily misled, and therefore you can make a good decision. So here are some of the harsh realities of life that we talk about in our book. The laws of nature do not generate life. The laws of nature present many hard problems. Life requires innovative solutions to overcome these problems. And left to themselves, the laws of nature actually cause death. Life requires outside help, a master designer engineer. And 18 of our 24 chapters in our book tells you all about this. So we look at the body human body from three perspectives in our book, Your Design Body. There's the medical perspective. We talk about control systems and fine-tuning, what you'd call the Goldilocks principle. Because if everything isn't just right, you're dead. I should know, I'm a hospice doctor. We also talk about dynamic capacity management, which is sort of how the body deals with things that are changing inside of it and outside of it. We look at it from the engineering perspective. How do you make all this work? And it turns out you need something called coherent interdependent systems, which I'll define soon. Finally, we look at causation. Where did all this come from? All the systems are what we call irreducibly complex, meaning that they all consist of several well-matched parts. And if just one part is missing, it doesn't work. We also encounter a lot of chicken or egg problems where some systems are actually dependent on their own function. So how can they come to be? And then the final question is, well, where did all this come from? Was it just all natural causes like materialism or Darwinism tells us? Or was some sort of intention, some sort of intelligence involved? I'd like to start by just telling you a little bit about control systems, because there's control systems all over your body. Every control system needs three parts. The first is a sensor that senses what you're trying to control. Otherwise, how can you control it? The second part is an integrator. It analyzes the sensory information it receives. It makes decisions if something needs to be done, and it sends out instructions to correct the problem. Finally, there's an effector. It receives these orders from the integrator and does what needs to be done, which affects the sensor. So it feeds back on the sensor so the system knows what's going on. So a good example of this would be heating or air conditioning system. I'm from Florida. It's a little warm here, but I came here last night and I had the heat was on. The temperature was set at 72. So your heating system has a sensor that detects the ambient temperature, and the heating system also has a thermostat, which is your integrator, and it's set at 72 degrees. If the temperature drops below 72 degrees, the thermostat turns on the heating, the heat comes on, and it feeds back on the sensor, which tells the thermostat that the temperature comes back to 72, and it stops. So you can see this as an irreducibly complex system. It has a sensor, an integrator, and an effector. How can it work without all three of them? And so it shows that Darwin's gradualism fails. It's totally impossible. His idea that one step at a time life could come into being, all you have to do is have one control system, and Darwinism fails. Most people don't know that, I guess. So what we look at in the book, from the medical perspective, we look at how the body controls chemical parameters like oxygen, water, sugar, and salt. Physiological parameters like temperature, respiration, heart rate, blood pressure. We look at dynamic capacities like regional blood flow and clotting and immunity. Special sensories like vision, hearing, balance, and movement. Reproduction, not only just male and female, but also being fertile, being actually able to reproduce. And the development of a one-cell zygote to adulthood, 30 plus trillion cells in your body. Then there's the engineering perspective, because everything I just talked about in the medical part, well, those are a lot of hard problems. Each medical issue is a hard problem that has to be solved. And each needs a coherent system. What's a coherent system? It's a system that consists of many specifically made parts, assembled just right and doing the right jobs. But on top of that, the systems are interdependent, because to get any one job done, most of the time you need more than one system. For example, the lungs bring in oxygen and they put it in the blood, right? But the lungs cells need oxygen. They only get that oxygen from the blood that's pumped from the heart. So you need the lungs and the cardiovascular system. So that's why you need coherent, interdependent systems to be able to accomplish most of the jobs for the body to live. And then many of the systems are dependent on their own function. You have a chicken or egg problem. Which one came first? And once again, the lungs bring in oxygen, but all the lung cells need oxygen. So how could they come into being? So this is so important that a good part of our book, which Steve deals with a lot, is how to design, build, launch, maintain, and reproduce coherent interdependent systems. Finally, we look at causation. We have to consider the causal hurdles. Where did the information come from to make all these systems? And how did they come about if the organism had to be alive at each stage along the way? So by knowing this, you can ask better questions about origin of life, being alive, that's what our book talks about, what does it take to stay alive, and also reproduction. And this allows you to demand better answers. You have to educate yourself, and this is what our book does for you, to understand how life works, so you can ask better questions, ones that explain, not explain away. We don't want any just so stories. There's no magic allowed. So a typical response from a Darwinist would be, if you ask, well, where did that system come from? Well, here's specifically what they'll say. Selective pressure made it emerge, and then, because it worked so well, it was conserved. Well, how? You want to give me a little more information than that? A little more detail? And at the end of the day, there's only two explanatory options on the table. Either materialism is right, in other words, unguided processes, unplanned, purposeless, totally lacking in foresight, or there was some intelligence somewhere along the way. It was guided, planned, purposeful, and dripping with foresight. So let's get into the actual biology and physiology. So a unicellular or one-celled organism like an amoeba is like an island of life. It can get what it needs and get rid of what it doesn't need from its surrounding environment, which is water. Whereas we, 30 plus trillion cells, we're like a deep continent of life. 99.99% of our cells are not near the surface. The only ones are in the skin, right? Maybe in your eyes, etc. Right? So we talked about a lot of hard problems. So the cell has a lot of hard problems it has to solve. We have a really good chapter on the cell, chapter 1. It's really good because Steve wrote it. But one of the big things everyone knows, you need to have energy. Every machine needs energy. You need energy to live. And so the cell does that through cellular respiration. Michael Denton talked to you about that a little bit last night, showed you the equation. But the cell uses a sugar called glucose, and in the presence of oxygen, it grabs the energy out of glucose and is able to store it. And in that equation, in that reaction, it releases a toxic product called carbon dioxide. So for the cell, because it's surrounded by water, it's able to get its sugar and its oxygen from the water, and it releases carbon dioxide, right? But for us, that's a crazy hard problem because we need our respiratory system to bring in oxygen, our gastrointestinal system to bring in sugar, put it in the blood, cardiovascular system to send that blood to the cells. And then you need the cells to send the carbon dioxide into the bloodstream and into your lungs and get rid of your carbon dioxide. So we're going to go here and we're going to try to solve just one problem, just to show you what it takes for your body to solve this one problem of a million hard problems that your body has. And that's to get enough oxygen to all the cells of the body all the time. Now, the reason why I've chosen this is if you really think about it, oxygen is sort of the limiting chemical factor in your body. We all know that if you don't have a new supply of oxygen every 4 minutes, you die, right? Now, you can go days without a new supply of water. You can go weeks without a new supply of sugar. But if you're an engineer and you're going to be making the body, you got to solve the oxygen problem first, because if you don't solve that, you don't have a problem with the water and the sugar, right? You got to solve this first problem. And we're going to look at the innovative solutions we're going to break this problem into 4 subproblems. The first problem is, how do you get oxygen into the body, right? We're not a unicellular organism, right? So that's the first problem. And the innovation is the respiratory system. The second problem is, well, how do you know when to breathe? And the innovation is respiratory control. The third one is, well, how much oxygen allows the body to do what it needs to do? And the innovation is respiratory functional capacity. And finally, how much lung functional capacity do you need to allow for survival? And the innovation is respiratory functional parameters. So the first we're going to look at is the respiratory system, and you're sure familiar. I think Mike Danton showed this last night. You have the lungs, you have the diaphragm at the bottom of the lungs, and when it contracts, it opens up the chest wall. It expands the chest, which allows air to be literally sucked into the nose and mouth, down through the airways, in the bottom left-hand corner. Those little alveoli. You have about 300 million in each lung, and they're each surrounded by about several hundred, maybe 1,000 capillaries or capillaries. I'm Canadian. I had to be trained to start saying capillaries, but you notice Mike Denton, he's Australian, so we have both British training. Anyways, that's how the oxygen gets into the blood and carbon dioxide comes out. So you notice all this has all the right parts, all connected up right, all doing the right things. Now, how did that happen? Then you have respiratory control. You notice if you hold your breath, something's telling you to breathe. Now, remember, to control something, you have to have a sensor, an integrator, and an effector. What's the sensor going to be checking? Well, we're talking about oxygen and carbon dioxide. You have oxygen and carbon dioxide sensors that are in the main arteries that go to your brain, and carbon dioxide sensors in the brainstem. Now, you notice these are in the right place. They're in the arteries. That's because it's the oxygen in the artery you need to know. You don't want the sensor in the vein after oxygen has been used in the tissues. That's totally useless. You don't want these sensors in your spleen or your liver. They're right where they need to be, where the blood vessels are going up to the brain. And that information is sent to the respiratory center of the brainstem. Once again, it doesn't go to the visual center in your brain or where you have hearing. It goes right to the spot of the brain that actually is going to do the control. And it receives that information and makes a decision if something needs to be done. So what's going on when you're in between breaths or when you're holding your breath? Your body's continuing to use oxygen. And so your oxygen level starts to drop down. It keeps producing more carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide level starts to rise. And so the respiratory center has sort of a set point and says, hey, it's time to breathe. If you hold your breath, that urge becomes stronger until you finally breathe. And that sends out orders to the muscles of respiration. It doesn't send it to your arms and legs to have you get up and do a dance. It sends the orders to the area of the body that really needs to do something about the problem, okay? So you breathe out, which releases the carbon dioxide, you breathe in and you bring in a new supply of oxygen, all right? So you have all the rightly made parts in the right places, connected up right, doing all the right things. Now, how did that come up to? Then the question is, how much oxygen is enough? And Mike Denton, again, last night showed you this great slide. At complete rest, your body uses 250 milliliters per minute of oxygen. Slow walking, you'll see, is 500, is double that. Fast walking requires 1,000 milliliters per minute. Fast jogging, 2,000. And fast running is 3,500 milliliters per minute, which I call survival mode. Basically, this means that this is how much oxygen our ancient ancestors would have had to bring in to be able to survive, right? So how does the respiratory center know how much oxygen you need for a given activity? I don't know about you, But if I'm jogging or walking, I don't know how fast I'm supposed to breathe. I don't even know what I'm going to have for breakfast. Never mind, I'm going to figure out how to control that, right? It's lucky we don't have control of that, right? So finally, if survival mode is 3,500 milliliters per minute of oxygen, what do the lungs have to be able to do? What's their functional parameters? The chest cavity and lungs have to be big enough. The lungs have to be compliant and elastic enough. The airways have to be wide and open enough. The muscles of respiration have to be strong enough. You have to have sufficient numbers of alveoli and capillaries. The gas exchange has to be good enough. And the respiratory center has to know what to do, when, and how fast. So where is the information to make the whole system with the right functional parameters for each of these? Please tell me. And where do they come from? But wait, there's more. Have we answered the question? What's the problem we've got? The problem is we have to get enough oxygen to all the cells of the body all the time. We've only explained how we get oxygen from outside into your blood, right? Now we run into some cascading problems, and here are some innovative solutions. As Mike Denton showed you last night, we got a problem because oxygen doesn't dissolve well in water, and in other words, the fluid component of your blood. So the oxygen is coming in through the lungs, it's going to go into the blood, but if it's only in solution, it's not going to be good enough for the energy you need. And so the solution to that is you have bone marrow that makes red blood cells that happen to make hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is a very complicated protein that is able to grab onto oxygen, and that's what carries oxygen in your blood. Well, then we have another problem, right? Because if you need a certain amount of oxygen, 3,500 milliliters per minute to be active, and 250 milliliters per minute even while you're sleeping, because real numbers have real consequences. If you can't get that, you're not going to be able to do it, all right? Then that means you have to have enough oxygen carrying capacity, which means you have to have enough hemoglobin. How are you going to control your hemoglobin? Well, the solution is we have specialized cells in our kidneys that are sensing the oxygen level, and they send out a very complicated protein called erythropoietin that goes to the bone marrow and attaches to specific erythropoietin receptors in the stem cells. Those are what I call cells that haven't figured out what they want to be when they grow up. And it tells them to become red blood cells. So that's how you control that. But then we have another problem, right? Because hemoglobin needs iron. What I left out on purpose is that the hemoglobin molecule has iron in it, and it's the iron that actually attaches to the oxygen. But too much iron in the body is toxic. What do you do for that? Well, the liver cell is able to detect the amount of iron it has stored in itself, and in response, it sends out a hormone called hepcidin. We only know about this about 30 years, by the way. Of course, we know it all came from nothing, right? So hepcidin, which then goes to the gastrointestinal system and tells it how much iron to bring in. Finally, all the tissues need to get enough blood to do what they need to do. So if you're running, you want to make sure that there's more blood going to your legs and arms and the heart and the breathing, etc. But when you've just eaten and you're resting, you want to make sure all the blood goes to the gastrointestinal system. How does the body do that? Well, the nervous system, autonomic nervous system, and the actual tissues themselves send out metabolic signals, which tells the cardiovascular system to send the blood where it's needed. So life requires coherent, interdependent systems to survive. Where did these all come from? But wait, Steve, did you put this extra slide in? I don't remember. I thought I was finished. Oh, there's still more. That's right. There's other vital things to control, aren't there? And some of these, probably all of them, are more complicated than what I just told you. What about water, sugar, sodium, potassium, calcium, blood pressure, temperature, clotting, immune function, fertility? Absent any one of these parameters, and you're dead, or you're extinct. How could this come about by a billion happy accidents? Now, by the way, all of these are discussed in our book, Your Design Body. So here's some better questions you want to consider. What does it take to develop coherent, interdependent systems that work for life to survive, especially when their functions depend on each other, and that often they're even dependent on their own function, and that life has to be alive each step along the way? Well, that's pretty complicated questions. It's above my pay grade. It's time for Steve Laughlin to take over.
So my wife had the opportunity to hear Casey Luskin speak about a month ago, and she was absolutely amazed by Casey. She said, as she said to me, Steve, he can talk faster than you. So you've seen some of that this morning already. So we don't have enough time to go into all the material I'm going to cover. So buckle up. We're going to go fast, and we're going to skip a lot of stuff on the slides. So give me a call if you want to get more explanation. So here's what Howard just described. Now, I know you can't read that, but the good news is I can't read it either. So I think we're all good. What this is, we call this the problem of cascading problems. And this, by the way, this diagram is in a 2-page spread in our book. So if you want to study it a little bit more, it's actually a really high-level diagram of the way engineers work. Engineers solve, they start with one problem. So in the upper left corner, every cell requires oxygen for respiration. Okay, every single cell, including the cells in your eyes and in your spleen and in your toes. So, well, how are we going to solve that problem? So Howard just walked you through a lot of this, but so all the yellow boxes are the problems you have to solve. To solve the first problem, I got to solve the second problem. To solve that one, I have to solve 2 other problems. To solve those problems, I have, so that what happens is you just get this cascade of problems. And you can't solve the problem at the beginning until you solve all the problems down at the leaves of this sort of cascading problem sheet. So, and then down at the bottom right corner, you have to be able to manufacture proteins. If you can't manufacture proteins, none of this is going to work. So, and all the blue boxes are the systems that are involved in solving those problems. So some of them are just things like transferrin or erythropoietin, but some of them are whole systems like the cardiovascular system or the central nervous system. So the interesting thing, though, is although we started with respiration, we could start with any problem in the body, and we would get a very similar diagram of the cascading problems. And so what you see just here on the respiration is we touch almost every system in the body. And that's the interdependency. How can you build a body when you have all the systems depend on all the other systems? This is a really hard problem, the kind of thing that engineers have to deal with when they're launching a new system. How do you get the thing started? It takes whole different systems to get a system started. So that's why we call this the systems view of life. If you don't understand how systems work, you're never going to get through this. So I'm going to go through the next 3 slides really fast. And the idea is you don't need to understand this. You just need to be overwhelmed by it. Okay. So I'm just giving you a little hint about how you're supposed to respond emotionally, because my wife tells me I'm not very good at that, so I need coaching. So first of all, you need enclosures. You need to be able to enclose things, isolate, separate. You need harvesting. You need to be able to get materials from the environment. You have to be able to transport things from point A to point B. These problems are all over in the body. You need factories to produce materials. You need factories to break materials down. You need to be able to recycle and dispose of waste. You need to do a complete end-to-end supply chain. How do you get stuff from where it is outside your body to where it needs to be inside your body? You need to manage chemistry. You need to manage energy. You need to manage heat. You need to find materials. You need copper, manganese. There's hundreds of chemicals your body needs. Every one of those needs a control system. You need to be able to build structure, shape, and size. You know that the bones, the 3 bones in your middle ear, the ossicles, are the only bones in your body that are fully formed at birth. They never grow. Now, if you were an engineer and you had to build a system that could do that, how would you go about designing that? I mean, that's actually a pretty thorny problem all by itself. You got motion and strength. How do we call this the push-pull problem in our book. If I could withdraw my arm but not push it back out again, what good would I be? So you need pairs of things which are completely different systems. You need You need muscles and ligaments and tendons, and they all have to be connected in the right places to achieve their function. Fluid dynamics, you have a lot of fluid problems you have to solve in your body. You need to be able to defend against things that, let's face it, your body's filled with all kinds of great materials because of all these other things. You have your supply chain, and you need respiration, you have sugar in your body. Well, that's a great host environment for bacteria and viruses and fungi. So you got all kinds of critters that are going to kind of come and live on the off the good of the land. So you got to be able to deal with that. How do you heal and repair? John broke his foot, but it's working again. How does that happen? And that's weird. Adaptation, you need to be able to adapt to changing conditions. You need to be able to direct blood exactly to the places where it's needed and not to the places where it's not needed. You need to optimize. You need to have signaling and communication that's all over the place. You need to do physiological controls, like things like blood pressure. Still more requirements. You need coordination mechanisms and programming, logic and computation, information and information processing. You need to automate. Almost all the stuff you need to do to stay alive happens without you ever thinking about it. That frees you up to do things like designing a cathedral in France. I haven't done that myself, but I'm giving it some thought. Sexual reproduction. By the way, we had a question we were presenting about this material a while back, and a woman raised her hand. She says, "So, is your book a romance?" I mean, what do you do with that? And so we said, "Well, we got a chapter on sexual reproduction," so I'd say yes. But then I'm an engineer. So cell differentiation. How do you start with one-celled zygote and create hundreds of different cell types? How do you turn a one-cell zygote at conception into 30 or more trillion cells in an adult? And how do you track a life cycle across 70 or 80 or 90 or hopefully more years if we stay lucid? So what we're looking at here, I'm just going to give you this is a quick introduction to engineering, Engineering 100. So these are the things I've got to do. I've got to be able to build homeostasis, what we call beyond homeostasis, which is balance, movement, vision, and then life cycles. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to compose those things from a bunch of lower level capabilities like communication, instructions, timing, metabolism. So I'm going to create a set of higher level things from a set of lower level things, right? Does that make sense? So, and there's a set of lower level things below that, and I call these primitives. In my world, we call these, so I'm a software guy, we call these primitives, things like enclosures, sensors, enzymes, machines, switches, timers, counters. And all those are going to be composed from the materials, chemistry and physics. So engineers deal with this problem called degrees of freedom. So we need to know, so we always design top down, never bottom up, because top down you start with the goal, and you break it into sub-problems, which are broken into sub-problems. Then the idea is when you solve all the problems down below, you can assemble the result. You can compose it into a solution to the whole, to the problem you started with. So now, if you're a Darwinist or a materialist, you've got a problem because you have to go the other direction, right? So you have to start with the chemistry, and somehow the primitives are going to emerge. You have to be able to signaling has to emerge from the chemistry. You need set points and tolerances and sensors and switches. And how in the world do you build a coordinate system out of chemistry? You know, that when you got your chemistry set in the 5th grade, one of the problems in the instructions was not design a coordinate system. Okay, it's an astoundingly difficult problem. And from those these capabilities have to emerge, and from those, the processes necessary for life have to emerge. So we think, when you think about it in this way, the burden of proof is on them. If they believe that this happened, I mean, this is a lot of stuff. If somebody's telling you that this happened, you should be able to ask them how. If they can't explain to you how these things happen, then maybe you shouldn't listen to them anymore. So we think that everyone's after us because we invoke God, but they're invoking luck to do all the things that we think God did. So I think they have a problem. So we have this engineering working group, research group, and we're working on a set of theoretical work. So I'm going to just talk you through a couple of things really fast. So the first is the first coherence axiom. Coherence is the ability for parts to be assembled into a whole, where the whole does a function that none of the parts can do by themselves. Okay, so it's a pretty simple concept, but obviously the more parts you have and the more complicated or the greater the number of ways that they're interconnected, the higher the coherence is, and therefore the harder it is to make one of those things. So this is the first coherence axiom. The greater the coherence, the more work it takes to design, assemble, and fine-tune into a working system. It has to work. And in biology, that means it has to be alive, because the alternative is not so good. So we call this resistance to organization. Things do not organize themselves. We think this is axiomatic. That's just the way the world is. So when we're talking about origins, we need a theory of generation. We need a theory that can overcome these causal hurdles. So this is really important, and it turns out that Darwinism, as far as we know, in any of its variations, has no theory of generation. There's nothing there that can generate anything that's non-trivial. So we have a second coherence axiom, and that is the greater the coherence of a system, the more work it takes to change one working system into a different working system, right? So when you talk about how a land animal turned into a whale, lived in the water full time, the number of things that have to change to make one working system into a different working system is mind-boggling. And this is where I spent most of my career, just doing this in information systems. So if I have a system of systems with 2,000 systems developed independently, do different things, and I have to change what they do, this is why the IT people get the big money. You can't, they're like dollar bills this big, you take it to the store and they won't take them. So we call this resistance to change, and that means we need a theory. This gives us a theory of stasis. So what we see in the fossil record, Casey has a great presentation on this, ask him to do it for you sometime. We need a theory that can generate things very fast, and we need a theory that then keeps them the same for a long, long time. So we call these causal hurdles. Like Howard said, we have millions of hard problems, which means we need millions of innovative solutions. So what can generate coherent interdependent systems? So Darwin has 4 causal factors. There are no others. There's variation, heritability, natural selection, and time. And he needs a lot of time. He doesn't have enough. But interestingly, magic is not a causal factor. Anyone who invokes magic in their explanations, they need to go to Branson and have a show, because it doesn't work in the real world. So the key issues with Darwinism, there's no theory of generation and there's no theory of stasis. This is a big problem. It's kind of like the ultimate problems. So another one is that time is not our friend. Time is where entropy lives. Things fall apart in time. They don't get better, they get worse. We know this. My knees know this. So a precondition of Darwinism is if you have variation, you have to be alive before you can vary, right? You also, if you're going to have heritability, you have to have reproduction. Before something can inherit, you have to have reproduction, right? So this is just kind of obvious. So it turns out the 2 hardest engineering problems in the world, which are life and reproduction, are prerequisites for Darwinism. So, I mean, you have to solve all the hard problems first, and then Darwin can do something. Well, maybe not. So I love this image of the guy who unties his boat and only then realizes he has one foot inside the boat and one foot on the dock. And that's a temporary situation. And I think that's where the materialist worldview is right now. The data is skewing away. It's never been good, and it's getting worse. So Stephen Jay Gould, revolutions usually begin as replacements for older certainties. So let's look at a new theory. We call this the theory of biological design. It also has four causal factors. There are intentional actions. There are the internal capabilities of living things. Typically, they have the capabilities to adapt. There's the architecture of life, and then there's errors. Things degrade over time. And we should note, we definitely want to point this out, magic is not listed here, although we'll be accused of it when we invoke intentional actions. So the key benefits here are we can explain generation, we can explain stasis, and we can explain most of, maybe all of, evolution happening before our eyes. If you've heard that phrase, I'm sure, we can explain that better. And we have a whole research group whose goal is to explore this theory. So stay tuned, there's more coming. So causal attribution, I just want to go through this really fast because I'm out of time. But a lot of these things are intentional, a lot of them are organic, and some of them sort of split between. So the adaptive responses that are built into an organism, the adaptive capabilities that organisms have, are put there intentionally, but the way they play out over the history of life is somewhat organic, so they respond to things that happen around them in ways that the designer might have foreseen could happen, but didn't know when or where they would happen. So we think this is a really important concept. So let's get back to our opening question. So there's a lot more here, by the way. So if you're an engineer or a doctor or a biologist and you want to get more involved, come and talk to me. We're always looking for people who want to help us with our research. Am I a cosmic accident or was I intended? And we're going to argue there is no question in the world that has a greater impact on the way you live your life. If I was an accident, then so were you. And if it doesn't matter, there's no purpose, there's no meaning, then I'm going to just do what's best for me and forget you. I can do whatever I want to you because you don't have any purpose or meaning either. So it leads to really different outcomes. So you start from different polar opposite worldviews, and you end with polar opposite outcomes. It's my thesis that a lot of what we see going on in our society today is a result of this very question being answered, in my opinion, very poorly. So our view is choose wisely. So no question is more important to how we live our lives. So if you're at an accident, the things on the left side, the universal asset, Darwinism has been called the universal asset, and it really does destroy the foundations of social interactions, social rules, social life. It destroys who we are fundamentally. If we were intended, then maybe we should live intentionally, which is a very different thing. It leads to very different outcomes. So David Berlinski, some of you may be familiar with him from his books or may have met him at an event somewhere. But he made this following statement, which I've always loved, this slight paraphrase. How hard are you willing to work to avoid the obvious? And I think we can see around us, there are some people working really, really, really hard to avoid the obvious. And I don't know, I don't have any tools to deal with that. So I just want to close with, I've got 33 seconds left, so we're good. For those people who are looking for answers, who are struggling with what they've been told, that they have no meaning and no purpose, for people who are coming to the realization that they've been hoodwinked by the unfounded claims of neo-Darwinism, the unfounded claims that you are an accident and you have no meaning. If you believe you've been misled by the incessant appeals to the authority of science, then we think maybe it's time you should listen to your body. In effect, it's been screaming design at you, and you probably just haven't been listening. I know I wasn't until I met Howard and started thinking about this stuff. So we have one issue for you to ponder, and that is, maybe it's time to come home. Maybe you should come back to intention, come back to purpose, come back to meaning, come back to a life that you were made for. Thank you.